do a financial statement analysis, you're going to need an income statement, a balance sheet, etc. We're going to be doing it for a company called Bradley Copper Wiring, and the first thing that I'm going to ask you guys to do is do a horizontal analysis of an income statement. So let's do this for Bradley. For Bradley, their net sales revenue went from $78,000 to $84,000. That, as you can see from here, is an increase of $6,000. Well, let's start with our amount column right here. If we take the current year's net sales revenue and last year's net sales revenue, we come up with $6,000 exact. Cost of goods sold was $39,000 in the prior year. It's $38,000 this year. Again, if we do the same formula, equals this year's COGS minus last year's COGS, we see that COGS decreased by $1,000. And we can continue doing this all the way down the line. But this is the joy of using Excel. See, if you click on a cell, so the green line surrounds it, your arrow, which is normally this big fat white cross, if you go to the bottom right corner, it turns into a slimmer black cross. That is called the fill handle. If you grab it and just drag it down all the way through the cells, it's going to copy that same formula you had all the way down. So now we can go and make sure everything worked out okay. Gross profit went from $39,000 to $46,000. That's an increase of $7,000. Selling expenses went from $7,500 to $8,500. It's an increase of $1,000. Everything here looks good. So we have all of our numbers filled in. You can go and delete the spots with the slashes really fast. So now we're ready to figure out what our percent of change was. Again, raw dollars isn't the best way to compare one company to another. We want to do it in terms of percentages. So we're going to start with our percentage here. And our formula is going to be equal to the amount of the increase, let's put this in parentheses, amount of the increase divided by the amount we had in the prior year. We'll close that parenthesis and we'll multiply it by 100. And when we do that, we come up with 7.7. We can see that net sales revenue increased by 7.7% from 2017 to 2018. Let's do the same concept here for cost of goods sold. Our cost of goods sold percentage is going to be equal to, in parentheses, the amount of decrease in this case that we had, divided by our cost of goods sold in the prior year, close the parentheses, and multiply by 100. We had a 2.6% decrease in our cost of goods sold, and I rounded all of these numbers off to one decimal. In formatting, it's up here on the top where you can increase or decrease your decimal. It's typical to have percentages expressed to one decimal place. So again, we could go through and we could fill in all those formulas individually, but we're going to cheat. We're going to use the fill handle and we're going to drag it down. And deleting all these weird div zeros, just click on them and hit delete, we get our percent of change. And we can see here that our gross profit increased by 17.9%. Our selling expenses increased by 13.3%. Administrative expenses increased by 4%. Our total operating expenses increased by 8.7%. So on and so forth down the line. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do on the test is give me in a paragraph a brief description of what happened. How can we take information from this to better our business as managers? Well, if I'm looking at this, things are looking good to me. Our sales increased by $6,000, but somehow, despite the fact that we're selling more, our cost of goods sold, our cost to either produce or acquire the wire, actually decreased by $1,000. So we've increased our profitability by either charging more or by selling more units, but somehow decreasing our cost to acquire those units. And even though we had an increase in expenses, that 8.7% increase in operating expenses is less than our 17.9% increase in gross profit. And down at the bottom for our bottom line, we can see right here that we had an increase of 32.7% in net income. Everything is looking good for Bradley Copper Wiring right now. 2018 was a much better year for them than 2017. And with that, we are through our horizontal analysis of the income statement. We can go to a vertical analysis. And I'm going to ask you to do a vertical analysis of the balance sheet. So, how do we go about doing this? Well, the percent of total column right here, we want to know what percentage of the base number that is. Again, whatever number we're comparing each individual line item to. And for a balance sheet, the base number is always the balance number, which in this case is our total assets. And if we scroll down, we'll see it's the same number as our total stockholders' equity and liabilities. So to figure out what percent of our total assets are in the form of cash, we can go and we can take this number and divide it by our total assets, and that tells us that our percentage is 10.1%. Fair enough. For our accounts receivable, we can do the same thing. We can take the amount of accounts receivable we had, divide it by our total assets, and we come up with 17.8%. So 17.8% of our total assets is in the form of accounts receivable, 10.1% is in the form of cash. For inventory, we can do the same thing, and I'm going to change something small up here, but let's start with equals inventory, and we're going to still divide by total assets. We want to use that fancy fill handle thing again, but the problem with that is when you use it, it changes the formula, and it's going to change the second cell that we're dividing by. We don't want that here because we always want to divide by total assets. So what you can do to stop that is make it what they call absolute by pressing the F4 key. When we press F4, you can see the formula that it changed from just B16 to $B, $16. Hit enter. 23.7% of our total assets was in the form of inventory. Now that that cell is absolute and it'll keep dividing by total assets, we can fill handle. And when we fill handle, we come up with all of our different numbers. Very important. Your total assets should always be 100% since that's the base number that you're dividing by, but we get our total breakdown right here of what happened in 2018. We can do the same thing with our accounts payable in the liability section. So we click on the cell, we hit equals, we click accounts payable, we click divided by, and we click total stockholders equity and liabilities, which is that same 236,500. Again, we don't want that second number changing when we use the fill handle, so let's hit F4 to make that cell reference absolute. And when we do, when we hit enter, we come up with 7.6%. 7.6% of our total stockholders equity and liabilities is in the form of accounts payable. Now that we have that, we can fill handle again. And again, these two spots right here that don't have anything next to them, let's just delete those, get them right out of the way. But now we have all of our information. We can see that accounts payable being 7.6% of our total equity and liabilities, accrued liabilities 2.5%, short-term notes payable 1.7%. Our liabilities comprise about 38% of our total equity and liabilities, which by the process of elimination means that about 62% should be in the form of equity. Well, this is great, but we have nothing to compare to, so we have to go through and do the same concept for our 2017 number. So let's click in the first cell. We're going to hit equals the amount of cash we had in 2017 divided by our total assets, which is our base number. We want to make it absolute, so we hit F4, so it changes the $D, $16. We hit enter, and from there we can just fill handle on down. And we're going to come up with the following numbers. Let's do the same thing real fast for our liability and equity section. Equals accounts payable divided by our balance number for that year of 2013, or 213,000, excuse me. We hit F4 to make that absolute, and we come up with 13.1%. Let's fill handle that, and then let's delete these two numbers we don't need. Now we have something to compare to. Let's start up here on the cash line. We can see up here that in the cash line, cash was 15.5% of our assets in the prior year. It's down to 10.1% this year. So our company has become more cash light, which could be a problem if we have an emergency expenditure. We just don't have the free cash on hand to be able to, repair a machine or make a purchase that we need to make. Our accounts receivable has increased greatly from 2017 at 11.5% to 17.8% in the current year. That could be a sign that our company is having issues collecting on our receivables from the people that we are selling to, so it's something to keep an eye on. In inventory, that increased greatly as well, from 18.8% of our assets to 23.7% of our assets. Maybe we're having issues moving inventory, or maybe we simply produce too much inventory for our market demand. There could be several different reasons for it, but the thing to notify is that we had a large spike in the composition of our assets with how much is in the form of inventory and accounts receivable, something we need to look at to fix. None of the other numbers in here are particularly alarming. We had a slight drop off in our property, plant, and equipment, but that's more so contributed to our increase in total assets than it is the raw amount, as we see it only went from 77,000 to 76,000. So talking points in your paragraph, those would be the two numbers that stood out to me. Go down to the liability and equity section. Our accounts payable was 13.1% of our total liability and equity the year before. It's down to 7.6% this year. That's a good thing, not to owe as much money, but it might be also the reason that we are operating so cash light is because we've been paying off more of our payables. Scrolling down through the list, you're looking for a significant jump, and one that is here that I can absolutely see is our increase from 19.7% of our liabilities and equity being in the form of long-term liabilities up to 26.2%. We must have taken out a loan at some point during the period. Not quite sure when that happened, but it must have happened somewhere, so it's something to keep an eye on. We are carrying more long-term debt obligations that could be concerning to our stockholders. Makes a good talking point. None of the other accounts really have that big of a representative change from one period to the next, so I think we are through our vertical analysis of our classified balance sheet for Bradley Copper Wiring, which means we can go to our common size. And a common size is a way to compare our company to something else, and typically that something else is your chief competitor. In this case, Bradley Copper Wiring's chief competitor is Hooter Home Wiring. So we want to compare our numbers to their numbers. Well, Hooters are given, as on your test, the competing company will have their numbers given as well. We need to fill in the numbers, in this case, for Bradley. Well, that's easy enough. Net sales revenue, what percentage was it? If we click in the cell and we hit equals, and we go back to our income statement, we see that net sales revenue was comprised of the amount we had during that year divided by what's always the base number for your income statement, which is your net sales revenue. So I'm basically dividing by the same number again. We're coming up with 84,000. For cost of goods sold, we're going to hit equals. We're going to go back to our income statement. Our cost of goods sold during the current year, which is what we're comparing right here, was 38,000. If we divide that by the base number for net sales revenue, we're going to come up with 84,000. For gross profit, we are going to have our $46,000 divided by our net sales revenue. You can see you can do this over and over and over again. What happens here if we make this last cell? Oh, not what I wanted. Sorry folks, hold on one sec. If we make this last cell absolute, well, let's click on this. We come up with 54.8%. From here we can use the fill handle because everything's copying down, and look at that, we get all of our percentages. So if we delete out all these zeros that we don't need on the header lines, we have a fair way to compare Bradley's numbers to Hooter's numbers. What's going to happen here? Well, cost of goods sold for our chief competitor is 46%. Ours is 45.2%. It's almost exactly the same, or in fact a little bit better. For operating expenses, our selling expenses are lower, our administrative expenses are lower, and therefore our total operating expenses are lower. And it also means that our operating income is higher. We have a little bit of dividend revenue. They don't have any. Our interest expense is about the same. Our taxes are slightly higher, but that's probably because we're more profitable. But in the end, in the long run, we are turning 27.3% of our net sales revenue into income. Our competitor, Hooter, is only turning 19.8% of their sales revenue into income. And the main reason for this difference is we are better than our competitor at controlling costs. Our cost of goods sold is lower, our selling expenses are lower, our administrative expenses are lower. And that's really the big gist of why our company, percentage-wise, is more successful than our competitor, Hooter. So we should be feeling really, really good about ourselves right now. One thing we have left is our ratio analysis, and I'm going to hit that up in the next video, so I will see you there.